All right, bows and bow ties. So, look, it's been a while since I've done a regular live, but I wanted to talk about being a stay at home mom. Now, for those of you who are new to my channel, I'm the Black Opinionated woman, also known as a bow. And I just want to point out for the record that, I am officially trademarked. So, in the next few months, I need to change my TM to an R, but I just had to throw that out there because I'm feeling myself. Anyway, there's been so much stuff going on lately, and there's discussion. If you've seen any of my previous videos, there's been discussion about the As the Pearl Turns saga. And basically it deals with a woman who doesn't look like me, who has infiltrated the Black manosphere, and they have exalted her. I have a point to this. And, they think that everything that is not Black is the example of womanhood, femininity, motherhood, etc. But I'm here to tell you, when I give my opinion on what it's like to be a stay at home mom, of course, from a Black perspective, um, I'm actually I'm going to speak from my personal experience. Now, some of this will actually, I think, go across multiple racial groups, demographics, or whatever. But I do have experience of both. I was a stay-at-home mom for about 3 years when I had my twins. At that point, I had 4 kids. And I hope you guys can hear me okay. Oh my goodness, the wind out here in these streets. I put my earbuds in for a reason, or at least one of them, so that um, it wouldn't be too windy. But hopefully, I hope I don't have to do this over. So anyway, let me get on into it. I'm gonna show you the thumbnail that you should have seen to get into this. Okay, that's the thumbnail. Now, I mean, I was just being a little cheeky about it, right? I put a bunch of toys, pots, and pans, and some cleaning supplies, but I struggled with the direction I wanted to go. I could do a typical discussion on what it's like. I started to give a discussion on why you want to be relatively modern and independent as a wife. There's so many ways of going with it, but I'm just going to stick with the basics: stay at home versus working mom. So I'll make this bigger for a moment. We want to talk about the pros and the cons. Now, remember, I'm coming from my perspective, so take this with a grain of salt. We'll go there. So let's talk about the pros. I would say, like any other group of people, I mean, why is it when I come outside, like it's got to be like, what is going on? So anyway, I just want to get into it. So there's nothing that can compare to you spending time with your children, having the biggest influence. I'm trying to tell my daughter not to come out here. Biggest influence on your children. Okay, it's some of the formative years. Now with my 4 children, I didn't always have the same amount of time home with my kids, but I stayed home with my twins for sure. Well, my twins and my toddler, but yeah. And I found that when I had more time at home and the kids were constantly seeing me around, even though they still did daycare too, believe it or not, because we wanted to have them socialized. There's something to be said, I think, in their security, right? So being there, if you're capable of doing this, let me just say, I understand not everybody is in that position. I was not in that position with my first child. Okay. My first child, um, he's not with my husband, but his dad and we just could not make it work. And we're actually still pretty close to this day, but I couldn't make that work. I mean, we probably could have, but I chose definitely to remain at work with, and I think it was because I didn't feel secure at the time to make that. I just didn't think that was going to work for me. But my other children with my husband, we went back and forth, and he wound up working for himself. And let me tell you, it was very stressful because not only was he working for himself for about 6, 7 years, and we made pretty decent money, it was stressful when you work for yourself. Um, we lived a pretty decent lifestyle, and it's expensive having children and raising them the way that we wanted to raise them. But there's something to be said for when you can be like that. that stable presence for when they know that your children know that they can see mommy, okay, or daddy, depending on how your family's structured. Mine was structured a little bit more, and I say with earmarks, traditional. There was something to be said for when they saw mommy. So yes, I had a bigger influence on my children. But I also at the time was very fortunate that I lived in an area where I was able to put my children in a daycare facility that was a Christian based facility. And also, um, there were a lot of people who looked like them. So my children early on, and actually almost all of their daycares and schools, they were affirmed in their identity. Okay, so a lot of people were like, "Oh, but you live in a bougie area." I'm like, "Yeah," and I was like, "It is what it is." But I was very fortunate. My husband afforded me the luxury of being that um, stable presence in my children's life. And then we were very intentional about when they were in private school. They went to private schools that had predominantly black children. They went to black daycares, that type of thing. And that was because at such a formative age, I just thought it was better for my children to see people who look like them. So they were affirmed early on, and I was very blessed to be able to offer that for them. Now, that's the thing as far as being a stay-at-home mom. I mean, a lot of times people will say like, "Oh, they don't do anything." It's really difficult, especially when you're around children, and if that is not your calling. Because let me tell you, it literally was just not my calling. Just being around a bunch of kids, like it taught me a lot about myself. I remember, I went from being a professional. I was a professional woman who made her own money and everything, and now I was staying at home. I had to learn how to depend on my husband, but that was what we agreed on, right? Depend on my husband. Um, at the time, my self esteem, I was still young too, but my self-esteem, I had depended on myself so much, and to be able to relinquish that was really difficult. Now, I want to stop here for a second because I know there's nuance and layers to this conversation, but oftentimes when you have people out here in this whacked out weirdo gender war that's going on, there's so much on both sides, and people are angry and they don't know how to channel it in the right direction. So, men who are like women should just do all these things, and I want to make sure people understand something. Like I said, I've lived on both sides of the coin. When you are used to making decisions for yourself, living for yourself, taking care of yourself, traveling around the world, I lived outside the country. I had to depend on myself. I had to learn how to make new friends, learn how to network, learn how to find, create safety nets around me, and then to surrender that, married or not, was very scary. And then on top of that, I was responsible for 5 million children. So being a stay at home mom was challenging in itself because there was a dependency there. And then, but the good thing was, like I said, you had the opportunity to reaffirm your children. I can't say that enough. Um, Especially in their younger years. I think it made it a lot easier for me to volunteer. It made it easier for me to be present for events. Okay, I didn't have as many roadblocks, I guess, as far as making myself available, like showing up, right, to whatever their events is, whether they were in elementary school or preschool or whatever it was. So in that aspect, I was able to enjoy more of the, I call it mini milestones, things that you don't necessarily think about until you see it, or little presentations they did in like daycare or whatever. So it made it easier for me to be present for events and to volunteer. I would say the other thing was, it took the pressure off of my husband so that I managed many of the household appointments. So instead of him or myself or whatever, instead of him having to take off and come home, he could just go out and worry about working and taking care of us. And I took care of the house here. I had to take all those appointments, even when I didn't want to. I made sure I shuffled my schedule around to accommodate for the household appointments, but it took the pressure off of him. He could like punt on that. I made sure I took the children's doctor's appointments and all of that. Like very rarely did I have him participate in that type of thing. Not that he didn't want to, but I was like, I got it. As long as you can take care of me out there. But that was our agreement. As long as you can take care of me out there. Sorry, I'm outside of the screen here. As long as you can take care of me out there, I've got you in here. And the thing was, during that time, I had to learn a lot more about myself than I ever thought. And that was, I had to really learn that it was okay to be more vulnerable. I had to learn, this was a learned thing now because I was too busy taking care of myself for so long. I had to learn how to network in a different way because I didn't get it was I had to what do I want to say? From a working standpoint, I was skilled, I was capable, I was all those things. And so I could use my intellect. Um in my experience, when I stayed home with my children, now my networking was different. It required me to be a little bit more emotionally intelligent. I had to network with many people. Um, but the good thing about being home, this part maybe didn't apply to me so much because my kids still did go to daycare a little bit, was your childcare costs will come down. Okay. You'll drive down those costs. There's pros and cons to this. But your childcare costs will come down. I think like I said, the biggest thing was though, I think I learned how to network. I had to learn how to network with people who didn't look like me in an emotional connection, like a different type of connection, right? Like I know how to network in a professional setting, but now this was different. I learned that I used to close myself off to people who didn't look like me because I had difficulty, I think, maybe trusting after just dealing with people in a professional setting. And I saw the subversive behavior, that type of thing. So it made me very guarded. But I learned that good people look like all kinds of people, and bad people can also look like me. Okay. Um, but yeah, I definitely learned how to network. I learned new things. I learned ways of how to manage a house with children. And especially when at the time my husband used to travel, he used to go away sometimes for a couple of weeks at a time. He would be maybe in Japan, Australia, the UK, wherever. So he would not be home. He was calling all the time. I was calling all the time. And he eventually just gave up that portion of his job because he's like, I don't want to leave my wife unprotected. And one of the things that we found was because he knew he was gone, he used to be paranoid, because he just, him being a father to him was one of the greatest joys. He's always wanted to be a dad. And so he felt like he couldn't protect us actually. So I learned that like I had to make him feel secure too, as far as like, hey, we're good, we feel safe, because he felt like I'm leaving my wife home with my kids. She's got all these babies. Back in my Peter Pan younger days, there was, you just never know who was trying to like engage in shenanigans. There was a lot, but you learn when you are a stay-at-home mom. Let me tell you the things I learned about myself and about being in a marriage, about being secure, being vulnerable. I learned a lot. I remember one day I used to play tennis, and I remember I was talking with some ladies. We were doing lunch or something, and I was almost in tears. And I never thought I would be emotional around people, especially people who didn't look like me. And they were like, well, what's up? And I was like, I went into my closet and bawled my eyes out. And I don't even remember the reason why. They were like, oh, honey, is that the first time? They were like, oh, that's pretty normal, actually. There was so much that I was like, I'm supposed to feel like this and I'm supposed to feel like that. I said, I don't. And they were like, okay. So then they would spill like the real tea on like how to manage at home and your relationships and all that kind of stuff like that. But anyway, I learned a lot when I was a stay-at-home mom, and I can always deep dive further. But I will say, um, let me move to the cons for a second. No, I'll finish with my one last pro. When I stayed home, I I was actually much healthier because I got out so much with my children. I was so active. And people are like, you had all those kids and you look like that? Well, I was super active. I was afforded the time and the opportunity. Now, don't get me wrong. I still had a schedule, right? I still had a schedule and I had to pick up the kids and had to keep the house clean and cook and all stuff. And I didn't like that. Believe it or not, that just wasn't for me. But I still had to manage the house. I remember my husband and I used to get into it. He came home one day. He's like, chicken again? I'm like, well, that's what we bought. That's what you bought. We went to the grocery store and we had, like, I was losing it, right? And somebody put me aside and she said, go buy that man a steak. I'm like, that's what was in the house. And she was like, but there's nothing stopping you from buying a steak, right? And I didn't even think about it. She was like, I think he just wants a steak. Like, go get him a steak. It was so basic. Now, let me just say this for those of you who are going to take all this out of context. No, I'm not sitting here just serving my husband, but he gave me the opportunity to feel safe enough, and I wanted to do certain things for him. Now, I'm not saying I always felt safe, okay? Because we had to work through it, right? I had needs and he had needs, and then suddenly I was dependent on this man, and I got all these children, and I was like, this is not what I envisioned. But when it was such a small thing that he wanted, for whatever reasons, I think he was just tired of chicken. And I was like, well, we went to the store, or you wanted to stop off at the store and you bought all this chicken. So why are you mad? Like, why didn't you buy steak? And people were just kind of like, that's just not something you want to fall on your sword on. If you know he's like craving a steak, just go get the steak. And it seems like such a silly thing. And I wound up going to get the steak, and it made his day happy. I think he came home, he had steak, and not that he's waiting for me to serve him. He's not that kind of person. But whatever was going on with him, and I have an idea why, but like he just wanted steak. But I digress. Let me get to the cons of being a stay-at-home mom. So like one of the things I talked about was networking. I would say one of the cons when you're networking is you're not going to find many Black stay at home moms. They have groups out there. I think there was one called Mocha Moms, and I'm not sure why I never actually joined it. But I remember I did not run into a bunch of Black stay at home moms. And then my neighbor was in this group. It might have been Mocha Moms, MOCHA moms. I think that's what it was. But she wound up having me join this group of all these new moms, and they were all brown women, minority women. I think she may have been Hispanic. The rest of us were Black, whatever. I don't know. And I remember when I hooked up with those ladies, and those relationships are feast or famine, but it was what I needed to see other people who look like me trying to raise children, staying at home with their children. And some had not much money, and some had some. And it was actually great. I didn't even care about that, right? But just seeing that there were women out there who maybe didn't have a lot of money, but they were home with their children. And I was like, because we don't see that often, it's not like we don't have that kind of example. At least I haven't seen it much, unless you're talking back in the day. But anyway, so just be prepared that you're not going to necessarily always have a bunch of Black women who are stay at home moms. The other thing that I found that was interesting was people were really interested in what my husband did. They wanted to know about my money. They wanted, so what did your husband do? Because they were trying to figure out, like, you don't work, you have 4 kids, they're still actually in school, and blah blah blah. And I was spoiled. He gave me that time to be home, whether I was with the kids or not. But it was 3 years where I did not have to go into work. And then eventually, it got to the point where I needed to go back, and that's a whole other conversation. But and plus, my children are expensive. I feel like I have an eyelash in my eye. Oh gosh. Anyway, so anyway, people, especially the ones who don't look like me, they were very interested in what my husband did for a living, because they were like, "You have four children in your home," and they don't typically see black women home. So there was a lot of interest, and it made me a little guarded in the beginning. But be prepared for people to ask you those kinds of questions. Like, earlier you heard me allude to, so I have a couple of notes off to the side. Earlier you heard me allude to, I was talking about financial dependence. I swear to goodness. So it's weird. Where I live is so open. So it sounds like these cars are right next to me, but they're not, because like it just the sound carries. So anyway, um the financial dependence. Now, if you're used to being a professional woman, it's going to be difficult. As much as we all say, I just want to be able to this, that, and the other. And you do. Like, you want to be able to take a break. If you're always on, okay, it's gonna take you some time to dial that back. Okay. As much as you think you're just gonna be able to turn that off, you're not, because you're used to making decisions and running things in your life, and goals and dreams and stuff like that. That took me some time. I remember when I got to the point where I was home, and when people would meet me, I was no longer called by my name. I was so and so's wife. And I just felt like I have an identity outside of this home. It was it was it was definitely something I struggled with. And my husband didn't I still don't think he really understood, but I think he tried after a while, when I think I was having a meltdown one day. I was like, nobody. I don't know what I was saying, but I basically was just frustrated, because I'm like, I went from being a respected professional to, I felt, and at the time, just somebody's mom, not realizing how difficult that role is. Um, and I also knew after 3 years, my husband and I, we talked about, like, that wasn't for me. It just wasn't for me. But nevertheless, the cons, I would say, is when you're a stay-at-home mom, having to get used to being dependent on one income. I don't care how large it is, but if you're used to being a professional, it takes an adjustment. You got to look at how you're going to budget things, but you also realize, like, okay, now you're the teamwork has to come in. I wasn't used to being dependent on someone. And I'll never forget the time. I've shared this story before. My husband came home, and I was looking like, who shot John? And he was like, what is going on with you? And he was like, why does your hair look like that? This is when I used to, wear. And I remember I was like, I don't have any more money, because I was going through all my savings. And he was like, well, just take money out of account and go get your hair done. He couldn't understand, like, what was my problem. And I was struggling with that, going from being a professional woman to being a stay-at-home mom. Having to say, I was like, I never had to ask for it. And he's like, well, then don't ask. Like, just go get it done. And it was just a weird dynamic that we had. And I was working through that. But yeah, you definitely have to be on the same page. You have to be a team, because when you're bringing in two incomes and now you're down to one, and although he had a pretty good income, it was still six people he had to feed. So the financial dependence was the one thing I had to say, okay, well, that was an adjustment. Let me talk about loneliness for a second. When you are used to being a working professional woman, and then you go and transition to being a stay-at-home mom, there is some loneliness at times. And I remember when I would network with other stay-at-home moms, especially the ones who didn't look like me, they talked about the loneliness too. They said, yes, it can be lonely for a period of time, because you're dealing with kids and you're home or whatever, and it's like your whole world and identity is wrapped up in, like, managing a house and everything like that. And then I was like, I don't like this. And they said, yeah, it can be lonely at times. You feel like no one understands. And then, depending on what kind of relationship you're in, there will be men who are like, yeah, I want my woman to stay home, but then they'll take shots at you. Well, what do you do all day? You're just at home, blah blah blah. You're not doing anything. I make all the money, blah blah blah. So I would talk to women who went through that type of thing, and they were like, yeah, you will deal with that at times. It can be lonely at times because oftentimes people don't realize that when you are a professional or a working woman, you leave the house and you get that adult interaction. When you're a stay-at-home mom, there's only so much interaction you're going to get from other stay-at-home moms because like you have a schedule and things you got to take care of for your house, they've got the same thing. And then your husband comes home and you want to, hey, you know what, there's that one thing, you want to talk to them and they're like mentally like, I need like 20 nanoseconds or whatever it is that they need. So, and I know when I was a stay-at-home mom, but one of the cons was there were times when I felt very lonely. And I was embarrassed to admit it out loud because it's kind of like, but you're so spoiled. Your husband does all this, you guys take vacations, blah, blah, blah. You're home, you got your kids, blah, blah, blah. Like, what more do you want? And the things that I wanted weren't material. They weren't material. I missed adult interaction. So I had to learn how to put things in my life in order to manage that side of things. Because, like I said, your kids aren't going to be there forever. You're not going to change diapers forever. They're not going to be in daycare forever, or they go off and they do other things. So, like I said, I talked about the pros earlier. I'm running through the cons for those of you who aren't in my live. I want to talk about personal fulfillment. Now, I've seen this before. Now, this is where I'm probably going to ruffle some feathers. But when I was a stay at home mom, some women enjoy the act of taking care of their home, stuff like that. I struggled with that because the things that I wanted to do, like I wanted to be fulfilled in other ways. I was one of those people that I enjoyed the act of solving problems, like the mental challenge, stretching my mind, having certain conversations, that type of thing. So I felt like I wasn't achieving goals that I wanted for myself, especially since I had gone through so much education and all this other stuff. And it at one point I think it was a hit to my self-esteem because I used to enjoy having these intellectual conversations, and now, and I say this with earmarks around it, I was a stay-at-home mom. What ended up happening, and this is just my experience, was I remember there would be times when I was out and about, and like I told you earlier, men and women, but people would just refer to me as so and so's wife, right? And for the longest time, especially when I played tennis, people didn't know that, I was an engineer, I had all these things, blah, blah, blah. I was my husband's trophy at the time. And I remember I was at a New Year's Eve game night and we were having conversations. I had been playing tennis and stuff like that. And people, I don't remember how it came up, but somehow it came up about what people studied. I don't remember what people did. I don't know, for a living, whatever. And I remember I chimed in and I said something about engineering. They were like, "What? You're an engineer?" And I remember I was like, "Yeah." And it was so funny was I remember at the time there was a woman who was a physicist. I said, "Well, I actually went to college as a physics major, and then I ended up with an engineering degree." And the whole room mouth there it dropped. They were like, "What? We just thought you were so and so." And it was the way they said it, as if like it was this, as if like being just somebody's wife. And at the time, that's what I felt like. I felt like I was just somebody's wife. So what happened was I felt like people weren't seeing me as like the full totality in who I was. My personal fulfillment wasn't being met. People had this notion that I was just at home buying clothes and spending money. This is, I kid you not, that's a long story for another day. But anyway, I would say being a homemaker or being a stay-at-home mom at the time was looked down upon, and I allowed it to infiltrate how I thought about myself. So those were some of the growing pains I had to deal with as a stay-at-home mom. Okay. Um I noticed that when I was home, because I knew eventually I would go back to work, one of the things was, and I talked to other stay at home moms, and this was pretty consistent. The longer you stay out of work, the scarier it is to go back. I was scared to go back. I'm like, oh my goodness, am I going to be a dum dum? Like, what is that? I was really scared to go back. Um, I I felt like the longer I spent time home, the harder it was going to be to enter into the market. And I talked to women who did go back to work. Some of them changed career fields. Some of them went back, and they went back part time. Every single one of them that I spoke to. Now, this is my collection of experiences. Okay, these are my. I always got to put up a banner. Everything is just opinions. Everything is alleged or whatever it is. I don't know. Every single woman who was a stay-at-home mom for a period of time, 100% of them, in my experience, I got to keep stomping this. They said they were incredibly scared to go back. They felt stupid. They felt like, oh my goodness, can I do this? They were like, how much have I forgotten? And it was harder to get back in. It was harder to get back in. Um, yeah, I don't know. I think when Yeah, I think I'll just leave it at that. I definitely thought that being someone who was a homemaker or stay at home mom or whatever was looked down upon, and at the time, because I was in it, I hated it. I hated it. But that was just me. But let's get into the other cons. I think I was concerned about my social connections because I felt like my social connections were primarily based off of my children, whereas my husband's connections were based off of being a professional and previous friends and stuff like that. Well, most of my friends didn't live near me, and now I had to make new friends, and it was all based on being a mom. And I got tired of talking about mom type stuff. I got tired of it. So let me see. I think one of the things that freaked me out was having a contingency plan. And that was like, what would I do if something happened to my husband or whatever? And someone had mentioned to me, they're like, you are a skilled woman. You're fine. I mean, of course, I would be taken care of should something have happened. Or what if he decided he wanted a younger model? I don't know. Like, he's coming home to a woman with all these kids. And they were like, you would be fine. Now, we had put some things in place, but those were just some of the cons, right? Now, let me just say this. Do I think there's one that's better? No, I think they're different. I was forced, I was fortunate to have the experience of being on both sides. And I don't regret it at all. I think it gave me an opportunity to not only appreciate more of my kids, even though they still went to daycare too, but it gave me an opportunity to see what it was like to really just knowing what I know now. I was able to rest in my femininity. I was able to learn how to trust someone more. Like, I didn't have to be everything. But let me tell you something. The reason I was able to do that was because of the man that I married. And also, he had to learn some things too. Okay. He learned some things too in the process. Like, oh, I need to make sure she feels secure, because one of the things I've said in many videos, as I said, women, we crave security in all forms: physical, financial, sexual, educational, spiritual, all those things. We need security. So when I was a stay-at-home mom, it gave me an opportunity to learn a lot more about myself. It really gave me an opportunity to really understand what it was like to work as a team. Um, I was present more in my children's activities at school, and I had a hand in the schools that we chose. I mean, I did all the work too. I was like one of those crazy kind of people, but my children were definitely more affirmed. because they knew mommy was going to come to their class for everything. And but now that I'm a working mother again, well, I can't be present for everything, but I felt like I put a firm foundation. But I'm definitely present in the evening. I'm at the practices and the games and all that stuff like that. And I'm still helping with homework and all that kind of stuff. It's just that now I'm not at all the different things inside the school. I'm not volunteering in a class or any of that kind of stuff. But anyway, I just wanted to give it to you from my perspective. I think I might do another video on the pros and cons of being a working parent. And if you think I'm making it up, on here, I have a whole list of pros and cons, whoops, that I've written down. Okay. So I swear to goodness, I think they know when I'm out here. I think the whole world knows. So, look, hopefully you enjoyed this content. If you have, go ahead and leave a comment. Let me know what your thoughts are. I would love to hear them. I'm going to go ahead and get on out of here. Go ahead and leave me a thumbs up. I'd appreciate it. All right. Take care.